Hi, I'm Tom Burgess, and thanks for listening to The Real Agenda, the podcast for political change. Now, today we're talking about living standards and how we have come to expect that they will rise with each generation. But the thing is, they're not. Why not? Well, there are plenty of evidence to show that the proactive government policies have actually contributed to a drop in living standards for the vast majority, whereas a small number have got significantly wealthier. A lot more so than the previous generation. Well, something's not quite right there. So I need answers. Now, back in May 2018, the Resolution Foundation, the independent think tank that's focused on improving living standards for those on low to middle incomes, published the full report of their intergenerational commission. It made stark reading as it illustrated how we were destroying the optimism and hope of the initial post-war years. So I wanted to find out what has happened since the publication. Like so many others, this commission had some high-profile commissioners representing most segments of society. But despite this, not much seems to have happened to move the recommendations forward into policy and to improving living standards of those left behind. Once again, it seems that the lack of political will to take up the challenge. So I spoke to Laura Gardiner, Research Director of the Resolution Foundation, who was responsible for the report, to get some answers. But first I asked her, what is the intergenerational contract?
We started off this programme of work by asking that very question, but we didn't just ask it of ourselves. We decided to ask the general public. So we did some polling, because you might think, what is this thing you're talking about? We asked the general public, do they think that each generation should have a better life than the one before? And people across age groups strongly supported that notion, while also strongly supporting the notion that it was society's duty to provide for older generations. And I think it's these kind of beliefs that represent a generational contract. The fact that in families and in the state, we put money and resource and effort in when we're in prime age, and we rely on other generations or take money out when we're children and when we're in old age, at the same time as delivering progress and growth such that each generation does better than the last. So supporting all generations, particularly those at the stages of life when they need support, children and people in old age, and delivering progress, those are the kinds of things that the public told us they think represent a generational contract that Britain should be delivering to its citizens. But the other thing we asked in that polling was, do you think today's young adults will have a better life than the generation that they came before them, or than their parents' generation? And by a margin of 2-1, people said, no, we don't. So in our view, that was the crux of the problem that our research was seeking to uncover and understand. Are the public right to say that younger generations today are at risk of not improving on their parents' living standards? And if so, given that people believe that's something that should happen in a growing society, what should we do about it?
So why the Intergenerational Commission?
At the point at which we set up this project, which was mid-2016, we weren't the first to land on this issue at all. There was a growing sense that alongside long-standing and ever-present inequalities on axes like income or ethnicity or gender, there was new evidence showing that age or generation was increasingly a divide in terms of living standards, and that was coming through in conversations about home ownership, conversations about the welfare state and so forth. Considering inequalities intergenerationally doesn't replace all those other inequalities. In fact, I think it gives us a better understanding of them. So it's not should we be talking about rich or poor or old versus young. It's not an either or option. These things are both important and they're increasingly correlated. That's our point. So at that point in 2016, there was growing evidence that this generational thing was becoming a problem. We wanted to do a really big, in-depth, analytical programme of work and policy-making process looking at that. And we knew that that would have more force and more weight behind it if we did it with a broad consensus and bringing together a broad range of opinions. So we put together a commission led by a number of high-profile commissioners to reach that consensus and to ensure that our analytical conclusions and our policy recommendations carried lots of weight. So we got important academics involved, like John Hills at the LSE, the heads of the trade union body and of the main business body, the CBI, the director of the IFS, a leading economic think tank, key journalists, and it was headed up by the Resolution Foundation's executive chair, Lord David Willett. So bringing together that group of people from different backgrounds, from business, from academia, from policy, a range of different experience to help us drive the analysis and come to the policy conclusions was how we thought we would get to the right answers and have a big impact.
So what were the recommendations then that you came up with?
I started by saying that the public thought that the younger generation was at risk of not improving on preceding generations' living standards. And in some areas at least, there is evidence to support that, or at least a big slowdown in the kind of generational progress we've come to expect. So young people's pay hasn't improved on their predecessors at the same age for 10 or 15 years. Home ownership's a catastrophe. Millennials are half as likely to own their home as baby boomers at the same age. Pensions have got much riskier. Changes to the welfare state, particularly over the last decade, have taken a lot of money away from younger and working age adults and protected benefits for older people. So there's clearly something that needs to be done to address those younger generations' living standards, but that is not the whole of the UK's generational challenge. People living longer and the large baby boomer generation moving into retirement means we have a duty to provide the health, care and social security that those older generations need, deserve and expect as the population ages. That's going to cost us a lot more money, so we need to think about how to raise that money in a generationally fair way. So our recommendations weren't just focused on the young, they were twofold. It was how do we deliver that welfare promise to older generations in a fair way, and how do we get younger generations' living standards moving again. So on the former, we concluded that we're going to have to look to raise tax revenues, because cutting those kind of that welfare state for that older generations largely rely on is unpalatable. Given the tough time that younger generations have been having, we can't just expect to take all that additional tax revenue out of income tax and national insurance. If we were getting blockbuster living standards improvements for younger generations, like we did in some parts of the 20th century, then maybe that would be fine. That kind of tax revenue would come out in the rounding, but that's not where we are. So we looked to how we tax capital in particular, how we tax wealth, to raise some of that additional money the welfare state needs. So this is things like reforming council tax to make it progressive.
And what, on that specifically, what did you recommend? I mean, council tax, by anyone's standards, is a bit of a mess. It's so out of date.
Yeah.
Actually taxing the wrong people, so it's being paid by tenants as well as landowners, and it should be paid by landowners. So what were you recommending when you...
Yeah. So you've landed on exactly the right points. Council tax is called a property tax, but it actually functions very much like the poll tax that it replaced 20 years ago. It's based on out-of-date valuations, it's highly regressive, it's paid by the tenants, although the economists out there are very complex arguments about who you charge the tax on. It doesn't necessarily represent who it hits, because you can pass the tax on in costs if you to switch the incidence. But stepping aside from all that, the main thing we recommended was scrap council tax and replace it with a progressive property tax. So rather than the current situation where the people in the most expensive houses pay the least tax as a proportion of their house value, switch to a situation where they actually pay slightly more. Make it progressive, update the valuation so it's based on current house prices.
So would tenants pay as well?
No, it would be paid by the owners, although of course in the long run they might pass some of that costs on to their tenants. So it's a bit, just because you ask a specific person to pay the tax doesn't mean they bear the ultimate cost, because they could pass it on in rents. But switching it, at least administratively, switching it to the owners, and in the short run, should rebalance somewhat who bears the costs away from renters. And have higher tax rates on second and additional homes is another key part. That's important because we need to raise some cash, but it's also really important because low revenues raised and the dysfunctionality of council tax have actually driven some of the problems in our housing market. So one of the things that drives prices, and particularly in certain parts of the country, is the fact that housing is undertaxed relative to other assets and relative to other forms of consumption. So there's a kind of a double win there. If you're worried about the housing market for younger people, you want a more functional property tax that's buoyant to property prices. If you want to deliver the welfare state for older generations, raising more money from taxes on housing via a reformed property tax is one way we think you should explore doing it. So that is why we focused on council tax. We also thought about how you tax occupational pensions, which have been relatively undertaxed, so particularly defined benefit pensions to raise money for the NHS, and how you fairly bring a small proportion of people's property wealth into asset tests for social care. So those are the kind of things we thought about to raise money for the NHS. And
so would that be sort of hypothecated then? It would be just allocated for NHS?
There's a range of types of hypothecation, from hypothecation in name only to an ironclad side pot that can only be used for one thing. And we're probably on the former end of that range in terms of this kind of thing. Sometimes this gets painted as some sort of capricious raid on all old people out of sort of glee. This is not the conversation we're having. It's not just raising tax for the sake of it. It's, if you look at all the figures from the Office for Budget Responsibility about what we need to deliver health and care in the coming years, we need a lot more cash.
It does seem to me, and you sort of touched on it there, that it's wealth where it should be taxed, because we all create the wealth. Just the fact that the house prices have gone up or the assets we've got gone up is actually necessarily nothing to do with us. It's to do, or if my value of my company's gone up, it's to do with the people that work for it, the customers, the roads that are there, the health service, isn't it? So therefore, isn't that where we should be taking the tax from wealth more than income?
Well, that's exactly right. As I've been saying, our focus was at a time when younger and working age people's incomes aren't improving, at the same time as the value of wealth has increased 3 times faster than the economy since the 80s, whereas the tax on it has stayed flat, and that wealth is becoming increasingly concentrated in older generations. It's where we have to be looking. It's really not always easy to do. The conversations about it are tricky, but it's a conversation we need to start to have as a country if we want Britain to continue to deliver its welfare state promise. Those are the choices we have to make.
Can't keep taking money, can we, off the people who don't have it with income taxes and other taxes, and we just mentioned council tax. It's got to come off the people that have it, but we've all helped create that.
We could have a whole separate debate about what's driven rising house prices. There's all sorts of things that have driven that, and one of the things, in my view, is the dysfunctionality of the current property tax system itself. So there's lots of reasons why we should be talking about this.
Give us some other recommendations then that you came up with.
Cool. So I talked a bit about raising money to support the welfare state for older generations in the coming decades by focusing on wealth that some, but by no means all people, particularly older people, have. And then the other side of the coin is we do have this living standards challenge that younger generations are facing in their housing, in their jobs and in their pensions and in their interactions with the welfare state. Given the data and what's happening to their living standards, we have to do something about that. So we've got a range of recommendations in all those areas. So on the labour market side, we need to provide a bit more security to young people who are most likely to be in insecure jobs. Now we have quite a tight labour market with record high employment. We should be thinking about restricting the use of 0 hours contracts, providing greater access to workplaces for unions. We also need to invest far more in vocational education, and we recommend doing that by cancelling the last penny of the series of corporation tax cuts we've had in recent years. On the housing side, we recommended new powers to give local authorities around land classification to allow the building of more homes.
Well, that's a serious one, isn't it, really? Because, I mean, it's pretty easy to build affordable homes. You just can't get affordable land. Land
is the key of lots of the challenges in the housing market. So we thought about how to tackle that in a number of ways. There's a few different. So part of it is getting that land ready out there for building, and it's kind of land auction type models that lots of different people have recommended have a lot of merit. So we looked at versions of that, with the local authority essentially having more powers than it currently does to bring that land into kind of residential housing. So we have a kind of social care precept on council tax at the moment, which is in all the wrong parts of the country, because the places you can raise the most money from council tax are usually the places with the least social care need, because it's full of often quite younger, rich people. But those are exactly the places we need to build homes. Change that social care precept into a house building precept that local authorities can raise a bit more tax revenue specifically to build, and we think you're onto a winner. And we need to de-risk young people's pensions. So auto-enrolment into workplace pensions has done great things. We need to really reflect on the successes we've had over the past 15 years or so, as well as the challenges. Really good things in getting lots of young people saving something into pensions, but those pensions are potentially less generous, but especially a lot more risky than the old final salary schemes that not everybody, but lots of people in previous generations had. Default retirement pathways, rowing back on some of the worst excesses of the new pension freedoms, encouraging what are called collective defined contribution pensions. They're sort of a halfway house between the old pension pensions world and the new one. It's techie but important, and encouraging the expansion of kind of larger schemes. Those are the kind of things we can do in the pensions market to try and de-risk the retirement savings of younger and working age generations while kind of continuing to build on the success of auto enrolment. And of course we need to get contribution rates up. That's another big part. And the onus should be on the employer in the first instance to go the next step up in terms of minimum pension contribution rates. So they should at least be matching what employees are required to put in.
And has that covered most of the sort of 10?
I mean, I think we had 38 recommendations in the final report. I've probably got myself into double figures there.
Oh, okay.
I've probably forgotten a few. Well, what I haven't mentioned is the most eye-catching and probably controversial policy that we announced. So throughout what I've been saying, it's clear that wealth has become a bigger deal in the UK. Our analysis shows that increasing proportions of that wealth aren't consumed within people's working lives, within people's lives at all, actually. They're passed down to the next generation in gifts and inheritances. Now, it's really good, older generations wanting to support their younger kids, but unfortunately those inheritances are going to be very unequally distributed, with millennials who already own houses being far more likely to inherit large amounts of housing wealth, for example. So one of the reasons why we focused on these intergenerational differences in this analysis is because we're worried that if they are left to sort of flow through the system untouched, they will drive greater intra-generational or wider social inequalities in future. Wealth is really important to people, even a bit of wealth near the start of life. It gives you a basis to fall back on. It gives you something that allows you to take risks in your job or in your education, maybe go back and doing a bit more studying. We felt that everybody needed that kind of inheritance style backstop. So we recommended reforming inheritance tax so that it was fairer and raised a bit more money, and we got rid of a lot of the ridiculous loopholes that currently exist in it, and using the revenues raised to implement a citizen's inheritance, restricted use payment of £10,000, asset payment of £10,000 to all 25-year-olds to be phased in over the next decade or so. That would be restricted to paying a housing deposit, investing in your skills and education, putting money into your pension, or starting a business. Positive things that we know people with wealth are much more likely to do than people without. The bung for the young, as we like to call it internally, is definitely a controversial idea, but it's similar ideas were recommended by the IPPR's Commission on Economic Justice, which published a few months after ours. And I think if we want to take seriously wealth in society and the intergenerational ramifications of all that wealth and how it cascades down, we need to really be thinking about how to give all young people the kind of chance that having rich parents affords you.
And it comes back to, what is wealth? I actually think the whole profit and being able to accumulate some wealth is a great idea. It's just that it gets accumulated by the few in huge amounts. Mm-hmm. And so therefore we need to address that. And as we were saying earlier, we've all played a part in creating that wealth, but it's only with a few. So any move that helps share that wealth more equity must be a good one. So you've got some very good recommendations in there. You mentioned the IPPR economic justice. So are some of the things that you put across similar to what they put in their report?
I think there's overlaps between the stuff we covered in our Intergenerational Commission and the work that lots of other think tanks and policy organisations are doing. So we are certainly not alone in calling out the inadequacies of the current council tax system. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has very similar ideas to ours. There's some overlaps with the IPPR's Commission on Economic Justice on some of the things we said about welfare state and how universal credit functions for younger adults. There's a number of other think tanks out there calling for the same kinds of things as us. So it's not like it's all easy or it can all be done tomorrow. The politics is a lot harder, but both within our set of commissioners and across the spectrum of policy debate, you can see a consensus building around some of these ideas. So even just on what was previously a really hard issue like house building and the public's opposition to it, you've seen that fall away over recent years as the kind of housing crisis for young adults in particular has become more apparent, and policy is starting to move.
So what's happened since? So you produced a report, we've just referred to the IPPR report, similar sort of areas, and various other reports on these things. What's happened since yours? How have we progressed towards some of these becoming policy? Have they been taken up by other organisations?
Well, I think it's fair to say that in terms of politicians, their attentions have been largely on other things for the past year. So that the bandwidth in policy making
But that's their excuse. They're just making...
Well, I mean, it has taken up quite a lot of time.
Yeah.
Politics is in a strange place, let's put it that way.
Okay.
But in terms of the momentum around this debate and these ideas, I mean, so we had a really high-profile report from the House of Lords a couple of weeks ago covering really similar ground and making a lot of the same recommendations we did in terms of addressing intergenerational fairness. I think just last week, Damien Green did a report for the Centre for Social Justice, I think it was CSJ, on reforming social care, addressing the social care crisis, which raised many of the same issues we did. And the government is starting to think, in the gaps between the Brexit debate, about things like where do we go now we're no longer in a phase of delivering welfare cuts to working age households. What are the next steps for auto-enrolment into workplace pensions? And there is really good progress, for example, on getting legislation in place to allow these collective defined contribution pensions, these kind of halfway house between the old ones and the new ones pensions to come into effect. So it would be wrong to say that there's been loads of action, and I think that's, you know, largely a reflection of the kind of wider context, but on the individual issues we've been talking about, there's been some interesting progress, and I think that the debate around intergenerational fairness and the living standards of different generations has only intensified, which is why we're continuing to do analysis on it, to talk about it and to develop policy recommendations to meet the challenges Britain faces.
This is urgent. You know, we've got 14 million in poverty, and some of these measures are long overdue. What can we, the people, do to make some of these changes happen and happen faster?
Well, I think one of the interesting and challenging things that our research, and actually especially the research of other organisations like the House of Lords Committee I mentioned, has uncovered is one of the reasons why the generational contract might be under strain is because generational integration in society seems to be breaking down. People increasingly live in areas that overwhelmingly contain people of the same age as them. There's some evidences that our workplaces are increasingly age segregated, and it's harder to hold the generational bonds in society together if we're not spending very much time thinking about how we interact with the different generations outside of our families. So I think the House of Lords had some really interesting recommendations about how local authorities and other kind of bodies and community groups can support generational mixing, because this isn't about one generation against the other. We're certainly not in the business of promoting generational war. We think generations do really care about one another, but we've just sort of, due to a variety of economic and structural and other reasons, got in a position where the state's having a hard time delivering on its duties to provide for all generations at different points in their lives. So I think different ways that we can promote and provide opportunities for generational mixing is one really positive thing. The other really big thing is voting. So the democratically elected politicians will always have a keen eye to who their electorate is, and one of the big trends we've seen over the past 2 or 3 decades actually is increasing gap between the propensity of younger and older people, age groups, to vote. This is actually linked to some of the other stuff I've been talking about, so it seems particularly linked to more people in the private rented sector. You're much more transient and likely to move around in the private rented sector, which seems to mean that you're much less likely to manage to get yourself on the electoral register. So some of the housing insecurities that we've uncovered seem to be driving some of the turnout gaps that have opened up. But that's not very healthy for a democracy, and it can drive politicians to bias their policies towards the needs of generations who are more likely to vote. More young people voting would be a really positive way of bringing this debate even further to the fore. More community mixing between different generations. And yeah, I think those are 2 things we could do right now. I'm sure there's others, and I'm sure if we talk about what local authorities could do on creative building plans, there's tons of stuff.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that, actually, Laura, and thank you very much for your time and explaining it to us. You know, and I wish you all the best trying to get this message out and that we can actually see some action.
Great, thanks very much.
Well, thanks for that, Laura. You can find out more about the Intergenerational Commission on the Resolution Foundation website at resolutionfoundation.org. Now, once again, we wonder, how did we get into this mess? The Resolution Foundation have made some good, sound recommendations, many of which concur with other research bodies and provide a solid basis for policy recommendations. The evidence is there. How do we translate it into action? But that's where you come in. There seems to be so many think tanks doing some very good research and analysis on very important issues that need solving. But instead of think tanks, maybe we need more do tanks. But then there are many great campaigning organisations pushing for change. But still there are 14 million people in poverty. That's 1 in 5 people having a tough time every day. Now, it need not be that way. Some change is behavioural, like being more compassionate to one another, which we should try to do so. But the other is political. So petition your MP, vote in elections, talk about it to your friends, join a campaigning group, get involved in a charity directly helping those that need it, stand for public office yourself, and if you are in a position to donate funds to a group that represents your concerns and is active in bringing change, then please do so. Be positive, spread good vibes on social media, but not rumours and insults. So what do you think? Do email us on info@realagendaradio.org with your comments and ideas, as this is your show and we'd love to hear from you. So what's up next on The Real Agenda? Well, we'll have more MPs soon in our Around the House series, and we're also meeting more inspiring campaigners on our Challenges for Change series. So do subscribe with your podcast provider or by contacting us directly. That's all coming up soon on The Real Agenda, the podcast of political change. Now, if you're interested in getting involved in podcasting and creating programs, then we're looking to grow our team of volunteers. Just email for more info@realagendaradio.org, or also check out our website at realagendaradio.org. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. Now, special thanks to our sponsors, the Reverse Media Group, one of the fastest growing search and media companies. Find out why at reversemediagroup.com. One thing is certain, people want to see change to a more compassionate and just society, as well as more courageous politicians prepared to do the right thing for people over party. It's urgent and it's up to us to make it happen. That's The Real Agenda. I'm Tom Burgess. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.